I don't think you could actually be a James Bond. You're not cool, you're not easily likable, you're not a people person. You can't be an introvert and be a James Bond. It's impossible.
I remember at school there were really cool kids who wanted me to be around them because I was James Bond.
The name James Bond carries with it a lot of sense of hypermasculinity, you know, martinis and womanizing. And while I love martinis, the womanizing I'm not in for.
I pronounce female.
There's a lot of stereotype associated with the character.
I never got into guns because of James Bond. There's really nothing in my life that I have ever done because James Bond does it.
What car do you have? Do you have Aston Martin? Like, no, I just fly helicopters, but I don't think that they believe me.
I've been a daredevil all my life. Ever since he got popular, they'd say he's a James Bond before there ever was a James Bond.
Hello, David Zaritsky for the Bond Experience. Welcome back. I am being joined today by Matthew Bauer. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Hello, David. Very nice to be here.
It's wonderful to be here, and we are talking from kind of opposite sides of the world. Here I am in Pennsylvania, and you're in Australia right now, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm in Sydney, Australia, so it's my evening and your morning. But thank you for making the time for us this morning, David.
No, I was compelled, and not by any waggling finger. I'll tell a quick story, and then I have so many questions. But basically, Matthew, you sent me a link to a documentary called The Other Fellow. And I'm going to tell the story that I just told Matthew because it's very authentic and true. I was intrigued by the synopsis, which of course we'll get into in a second, but I opened it up and had full intention of watching about 10 minutes over my coffee in the morning. Here I was on a weekday. I still hadn't worked out. I was unshaven like this. I had things to do. But I thought I'd watch 10 minutes and then come back to it over time. I was so intrigued and so compelled to watch this, like some of the best dramas in life, knowing that all of this was true, documentary after all. I didn't stop watching it until the credits rolled. So it's a testimony to you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Dave. David, you're one of the first people to see this. So that's really good to hear. I'm glad that it kept you engaged. Yeah.
It did. So, but I'm jumping ahead. We've got to start with some basics here because obviously I want to talk a little bit more about your journey with this film than the film itself, because correct me if I'm wrong, there will be an opportunity in the future for the world to see this.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, we're currently doing a festival run. We had our world premiere 7 days ago. And so we're in some conversations right now that hopefully end up with that happening later this year. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, all right. We got to I'm going to put you on the psychiatry couch for a moment, but where does this all begin? Is it you as a Bond fan having an itch to do something and to create something with your documentary prowess?
I actually attended like NYU Film School, which you're probably sort of nearby where you are. And I, kind of am a filmmaker, and I was, sounds random. I was in a Facebook group for people that had the same name as me, and often these things come from these weird places, but we would talk about innocuous things like who's got Matt Bauer at gmail.com, who's got the Instagram handle Matt Bauer, who's got the Matthew Bauer at Gmail, this very innocuous stuff. And combined with that, I am a James Bond fan. I thought I was always the biggest Bond fan I knew until I met some of you guys. But I just kind of went, what would that be for James Bond? And what would be things like that if you had this name? And quite quickly, I jumped on Facebook and I kind of constructed like a spam email to send to guys called James Bond saying, hey, I've got this idea for a film. What could you tell me? Well, and two things happened, David. The first is they were hard to find because you can't join Facebook if your name is James Bond, because it flags you for using a false name. And they're also very hard to Google. And I don't want to get into spoilers with the film, but obviously that's very much part of the fabric of this movie as well. But they're very hard to Google because, of course, there's a billion results about James Bond. And so from the beginning there, I kind of went in this technology way. It's actually quite interesting. And I eventually managed to find them. And all of my characters on Facebook are called Bond James or JB Bond or James with like 3 A's or 2 S's to get around that. So I finally found them. And the very first person who wrote back to me was the actual final James Bond who you meet in the film. And I heard his story. And I can't go into spoilers here, David. It was crazier than anything I could ever have imagined about his name and the James Bond thing. And from there, I actually kind of worked kind of backwards through these other characters I found that could kind of get us to the end point where his story made sense. But I can say quite quickly, these stories they came back with, I was expecting Aston Martin jokes. I was expecting, martini jokes, shake not stir jokes. And actually in the film, we kind of burned through all that in about the first 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And we sort of established quite quickly what the rules of being named James Bond are. But then quite quickly dive into quite dramatic situations where it's not just what's it like to be called James Bond every day of your life, but what's it like if you're pulled over by the police and your name is James Bond? What's it like if you're charged with murder and your name is James Bond? What's it like if another guy called James Bond who lives in the same town as you is charged with murder? And then how those rules of being James Bond play out in those quite dramatic situations is something that it came together pretty quickly, because these guys came with a lot more drama and police and guns and some quite James Bond stuff that I wasn't expecting.
I have to tell you, that was my first impression. So the reason why I was hooked in the first 10 minutes is, you're right. The first 10 minutes, you're sort of, the viewer is lulled into, oh, this is nice. This is a Bond fans put together this wonderful homage for an hour plus minutes of just talking about the lightness of these people named James Bond and how maybe they can pick up women or not pick up women, or, a wink and a nod, like, I'm James Bond. Isn't that fun? Let's go on with our life. Very soon after, it starts to get these layers, and you're like, this is not a light film. And you're right, it goes farther, and I'm like, all right, this is the core of the film. It's this individual. And then suddenly you introduce somebody else, and I'm like, oh crap, no, this is the core of the film. And then you're like, oh no.
Yeah.
So it's like a real, it's not even like a documentary at some point. It's almost like this drama that goes on, that builds on itself.
Yeah, I mean, I was as inspired by a lot of I'm a huge Bond fan, but aside from that, films like kind of like David Fincher's The Game or The Usual Suspects, or those really like sort of clockworky, twisty thrillers, I found I was able to kind of do in this. And that there is a point which we can't really discuss that happens about halfway through, which, there's a murder and there's bullets start flying. And then, when you're talking about the extra layers, that's actually really just the warm up to the real stories that are in this film. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to go through some of the characters, but we're going to do it in a way that doesn't give away spoilers. I want to talk about more of your connection with the characters, because to me, it's very fascinating. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is James Bond. Surely you recognize him as James Bond, but I'm more interested because I do want people to watch the film and discover each one of these very colorful, very robust characters and how they factor into, I'm going to say it, one story of being James Bond, and why the importance of that versus the residue or the side effect. But when you're interacting and even asking a person like this to be in a documentary, what are their reactions?
Yeah, I mean, I will say it often varies by country. I find Americans tend to say yes to being in a film. They do. I think they have more of an impetus to be on television. It was harder in Europe and England to get some of our characters to agree to participate in this. This guy, I actually interviewed him first on Zoom, or actually, it was more like Skype back when we first met. But I spoke with him from Baghdad, where he is, in the British Army. And he's a guy called James Bond in the British Army. And so obviously we kind of had some questions for him regarding, what it's like to be in the Middle East and be called James Bond. But yeah, he was quite happy to take part. And he's one of our very British Bonds, I'll say that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And what I loved about it is, you've got people like this gentleman right here who, again, had a certain likeness, but this is where things start to get layers to it, I'll say.
Yeah, so this is, again, we call them all James, but James is a politician in Guyana, which is actually, it's sort of half Caribbean, half South American Guyana. But he's sort of down, in that area. And he's a politician. And again, we wanted to know what it was like, being in politics with the name James Bond. And again, in the end, he's a somewhat minor character in our edit, but yes, he's one of the many Bonds in this film.
And then, of course, I don't like to play favorites, but this gentleman was one of my favorites. Can you tell us just a little bit of intro about him?
A South Bend man has been arrested for murder. His name, James Bond Jr. Bond Jr. was taken into custody and is now being held in jail.
Oh, hi, Pam. This is Matt.
Hi, Matt. You are on speakerphone. Mr. James Bond is here.
Great.
He's ready for the interview.
Hey, tell them we smoking in here. They don't like it. Tell them, oh, well. Tell them it's the real James Bond, the Dark Knight. I got this nickname, the Dark Knight. I always call myself the Dark Knight. See, by me being dark-skinned and flesh, I'm the Dark Knight.
To me, it would seem like a great way to stop the other kids calling you 007.
Now, they'll never stop calling me 007. I still get that to this day, but I correct them because I don't like that. I don't like to be called 007. Oh, man, them two names pisses me off the most, being called 007 and calling me Jim.
You now want to be Jimmy Bond?
No, because Jim is a white person name, man. I already got another white person name, James Bond, and then Jim. No, I can't be all these white people. I can't do that.
Well, sure. I mean, he was not one of our original characters, but during filming, James was arrested for murder, and it came across our radar that a guy called James, but in fact James Bond Jr. is his name. And we actually don't even have time for it in the film, but his father and his son are actually both called James Bond as well. But he's James Bond Jr. And it came across our radar that a man called James Bond Jr. had been arrested in South Bend, Indiana, on a murder charge. And so naturally, when you're making a film about people called James Bond, I wrote to him in prison. And he agreed to speak to me on the phone, where obviously, this guy's obviously going through a lot of stuff at the time. And, I said, I'm coming from the media, but probably not from the angle that you're expecting. But he agreed to speak with us. And he very much, we tried to choose characters who were quite different to what our perception of James Bond sometimes is. And in his case, he basically blamed the police for targeting him, not just for being black, but also for being a black man called James Bond, because his argument is the police in South Bend target black people. And which one of them are you going to remember? James Bond. And look, that's his contention, at least. I'd rather not take a stance on whether I actually think he's telling the truth there or not, but that's his contention, yes.
What I found so fascinating about his story was, the interaction with his family and the surround sound of, I'm sorry to say, there are murders that happen in this particular area every day, all day. Yeah. But this one was highlighted because it was James Bond, and even the connection to maybe even another James Bond in a local vicinity.
Yeah, we followed this other, and we found this guy in the press as well, because we've then found another story about another man called James Bond in the same town who was then having lots of problems caused because these guys have nothing in common except the gun thing. And so this guy is like a Trump supporting Christian gun guy. No judgment in terms of this film. That's just what he is. But obviously, because he's so known as a gun guy, when there was another guy called James Bond arrested in the same town, he got very mixed up in the media storm of it. And he almost speaks for our James in prison a bit better when he says, if this guy's name was John Smith, I don't even know if this murder would have made the newspaper. But with this, it ends up as headline news, front page, and it's entirely because his name is James Bond.
Well, I want to give you a compliment, but it's due. So please accept it, as humble as you are. One of the things that I think, as a masterful, person who does documentaries, that you've done so well here is the weaving of the stories together. Now, some of the stories organically happen, but I've seen so many documentaries out there that have these siloed moments that really don't have a ribbon that runs through them. You edited this in such a way, kind of going back and forth in time and with characters, that they were really starting to connect, even to the point of starting to marry into the whole idea of people that were denying, the whole aspect of James Bond. This wasn't something that was being embraced, and yet they fall into the pit of having to accept it, like this gentleman here.
When a film comes out, there's like a gap of time when everyone who has seen it has this cultural connection they want to share with me, and they come up and they make comments, and I have no clue what they're talking about. I don't know where James Bond went in that film. I don't know what car he was driving. I do know that Daniel Craig is blonde because everyone wants to tell me that.
See, he fits the current Bond. Isn't the current Bond blonde?
Yep.
Yeah.
Do you think we've got the Daniel Craig look going?
No, he has a six-pack and I have a keg.
You're about the same age.
Wow, really?
Yeah, we are actually.
Well, nothing that a little workout can't fix.
I don't own that watch. I can't afford that car. I don't want to date those women. I find that I make horrible, horrible first impressions because when I meet someone, I know this stupid joke is coming. Whatever it is, there's gonna be one. No one catches me off guard. I see this glint in their eye. And I'm aware that they're not seeing me for who I am. They're seeing me for this stupid, iconic thing that has nothing to do with me.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, yeah, I will say, credit to my editor, Leslie Posso, who is just incredible. And this, the cut is very much her cut of the film. I was a bit adrift trying to get all the stories together. And she's really the person who, what she kind of decided to do was highlight 5 main characters and found the thread between all of them. And the stories do connect in the very last way you're ever going to expect, but the stories do connect. And yeah, this man here is James Alexander Bond. He's a gay theater director from New York. And again, we wanted to, how there's a new James Bond meant to be being picked at the moment, David. I'm sure you're very across all of this.
A little bit.
And the media especially, maybe in the UK more so, but I think quite internationally, loves to stir the pot of, oh, the next James Bond's going to be gay. The next James Bond's going to be black. The next James Bond's going to be a woman. And they love to throw these conversations out there that I think, especially in England, make people have a debate in the pubs and on Facebook comments about this kind of notion of who is James Bond? Who is this man? What can James Bond be? What can't James Bond be? And so for that reason, we really wanted to have a black James Bond, and especially with James here, a gay James Bond, to see what it was actually like for a gay man to be so connected to this character, and for me, it's the fact they're called James Bond is almost somewhat immaterial. What it does is connect them intrinsically to what you call the James Bond phenomena. And for him, James Bond is the world's most famous alpha male heterosexual. And meanwhile, you have this guy who he doesn't want to be known as a homosexual, and he also doesn't want to be known as James Bond. He would quite like to be known for who he is. He would quite like to be known for his work as a theater director, for instance. But as he complains in the film, he can't even find a review of one of his plays online because it's so buried by everything else. And then what happens with him, in the New York phone book, there are 10 James Bonds. His middle name is James Alexander Bond. So whenever anyone wants a real James Bond, including us, for a TV commercial or to go on the David Letterman show, he gets the call. And the bizarre thing is, even though he tells us, I hate this, I hate this, I hate this, he still goes on Letterman. He still does this, which is an ad for an online casino. And I think it's up to the audience to decide, does he hate it or does he love it, or would he not know who he was without it?
Okay, you created a segue without even knowing it, based on some of the next visuals that I have, because it is this love-hate relationship, some leaning more towards the hate, some leaning much more to the love. This guy, he's kind of the OG James Bond. He was James Bond before anybody else. So even before James Bond was James Bond. But then you've got, I'm going to just say it, the hate, that James Bond is a distraction in life. And you highlight individuals like this gentleman who went to the ends of really doing something to get rid of the James Bond name, didn't he?
Yeah, I think we say it at the start of the film, so I'm fine to say that James is actually a man who is now called James Hart, who changed his name from James Bond to something else. And I really wanted to find someone who did that. And obviously that's quite difficult for a lot of reasons. But James, what's interesting about James, you see here, he's here on the tube in London when Skyfall was being released. And of course it's hardest for him because he's in England, he's in London, England, which is the epicenter of the James Bond phenomena. And he's also, I've been saying we pick some of our other characters because they're quite different to James Bond. He's quite like a handsome 40-year-old English guy. And so he had to kind of go through those comparisons almost more every day of his life. And he was teased a lot. And he actually eventually got to a point where he decided to change his name and become James Hart and leave it behind. And I think these are quite drastic decisions for people. Always ask these guys, why don't you just change your name? And it's quite a drastic thing to do. If I just went to you, David, just change your name. That's not a small thing. And so it's actually quite a big thing that he does in the film.
Well, this next image, again, we talked about artistic interpretation of a film, of art, of images. In this particular one, I love it because you do have James Hart in the back, kind of almost lamenting about things. But then you have this wonderful subject at the core of it, with the highlight at the festival that you just attended. But more importantly, tell us about this gentleman, because I think there's a certain sort of ability to him that I found.
Yeah, so I think every film like this needs its quirky European character, and that is Gunnar von Schaefer. And I'll say, when we first started making this film, we did not want people who had changed their names to James Bond. I didn't want some silly person who changed their name to James Bond, but somebody actually wrote to us and told us about someone called the Swedish James Bond, and I Googled that and found this man. And yes, he's changed his name to James Bond, but the interesting thing is he's actually turned himself into James Bond. You talk about the Bond experience, David. This guy lives the Bond experience. He has turned himself into James Bond. He drives around in an Aston Martin. He owns a lot of the James Bond cars in the film. He owns the hovercraft from Die Another Day. He owns a lot of these items, and he dresses in the tuxedo each day. He drinks vodka martinis. I mean, when I first went to meet him in Sweden, the Aston Martin pulled up in the snow to pick me up at the train station. He got out, said, "Hello, my name is Bond, James Bond." And so that all seems quite funny, but actually he had a story of the why. And the why was that his father had disappeared at the end of the Second World War. And he had lost his father. And weirdly enough, and we'll kind of come to some of the Fleming stuff, I'm guessing, David, but he then in Ian Fleming found a kind of father figure through his books, because he found that in all the original Bond books, it's very post-war, if you know what I mean, David. And it's kind of through that, it was almost like he was getting to know his father better through the Ian Fleming books. And so he sees Ian Fleming as his father and himself as James Bond. And yeah, he's very funny, but it's almost like he doesn't quite get how funny he is. But he's especially, and I will say he's one of the most inspirational people I've ever met. I at first thought this guy is going to be crazy, but he's had an amazing life through turning himself into James Bond. He's a cool guy. He's almost someone who's watched a few too many of your YouTube videos, David, and taken it, gone all the way with it.
Gone to the next level of the experience.
Yes.
I will say this too, it's a bit of a confessional. For many years, I've known about this gentleman, and unfortunately, and I will say this, unfortunately, in the Bond community, he was like, oh, that's the guy that created the Bond Museum that calls himself James Bond. And unfortunately, he was relegated to that. What I found the documentary did was, of course, as many people as it provided a story that showed him as something very different. A gentleman with a lot of heart, actually, a lot of soul, a lot of passion, not just for the franchise and for the character, but for his own connection to the roots of his father, like you said, and his own story, and saying there is a very logical reason in his mind to intertwine the James Bond character with his own story. And I came away feeling like I'd love to share a beer with this gentleman. Like, there isn't this, strangeness anymore, as strange as it may seem to some people. I almost found a certain affability and likability to him.
Yeah, he's actually a really great guy. And I mean, I had the same view as you when I first went to meet him, David, because the thing is, a lot of the stuff online about him is from Sweden. And in Sweden, he's treated as a joke. You know what I mean? He's the Euro trash joke that goes on the joke programs. They all laugh about the crazy man who's turned himself into James Bond. But I think as more of kind of an international filmmaker, I didn't come in and see him as a joke. He's very funny. But I took his story quite seriously. And I think those in the Bond community who have maybe laughed at him in the past, it's good to hear from you, David, that it showed you another side to I'd never heard of the Swedish James Bond, but I know that some of you guys have come across him in your travels, if you will.
Yeah, or discussions. And all right, so we're gonna change the tune just a tiny bit, because one of the things that I love, and I think my audience loves too, is behind the scene moments. So these are things, I think we've given people enough tease and flavor. There's some wonderful Fleming connections in there as well that you hinted to, but I want people to see this film. So what I'd love to do is a couple of questions of behind the scenes. Now, we are seeing the final product. You've already won some awards, some wonderful accolades. I have no doubt you will win more. I will say this, though. I know that these journeys are always just filled with alligators that you've got to jump over from time to time. Do you have any stories of like times when you were like, what have I done? And, how long is this taking? And, what did I get myself into?
Yeah, it's been a long journey with this film. We began filming around Skyfall when that began. And we kind of thought we might film between like sort of Skyfall and Spectre, and in the end, this was like a 9-year journey for me making the film. And I think in the end, you'll kind of see the level of work that's sort of in there. And, beyond this, I know I always had a thing with this film a bit, David, that people actually always went to me, wow, that sounds like a great idea for a movie. But at the same time, they were always like, I don't know how you make that a 90-minute film. And to be fair, it took me a while to figure that out as well. And that was sort of one of the big challenges of it. And I think that, it may come across as a slightly gimmicky concept, but the thing for me was actually to take this dead seriously. I mean, this film is very funny at points, but it never winks at the camera. There's never a Roger Moore wink at the camera. There's never a double take. I think audiences will be surprised just how seriously we take this concept of being James Bond. But yeah, it was a very long journey for me, and there were points where I wasn't sure we would finish it. I think that's very common for a lot of filmmakers. I'll say the big favor for me was actually the pandemic. Because I finally was able to, I was locked down in London for essentially a year, and I was able to get the film finished. And actually, I suddenly had all the time in the world to finish it, and I was struggling. And the biggest thing that forced me to do was hire an editor. And I found an incredible editor. And, as a first-time filmmaker, I was like, oh, I'll edit the film myself, because unfortunately we all have Premiere Pro on our computers these days. But the biggest change for me was finding a good editor, and to any filmmaker out there, that's the thing that makes or breaks a film. Because in the end, especially with a film like this, where you have hundreds of hours of footage, having her to put this all together in about the past year or so, that's what made the big difference. But yeah, it's been a long journey, David.
I can imagine. Well, it's well deserved. All right. So my second question, and I asked this of a lot of people. I just did an interview with the costume designer for No Time to Die, Sutarat, and I asked her what I ask a lot of people that work on these things, which is about the cutting room floor. And she gave me a wonderful story based on that of something that didn't appear in No Time to Die, and it was fascinating. For you, was there something, some story that wound up not in the film where you're like, shit, I can't do this? And if you can't say it, maybe hint towards it.
No, I mean, it's a shame my editor's not here because this was the back and forth in the room a lot. And unfortunately, when you make a documentary, most of your footage is in like 99% of your footage ends up on the cutting room floor. I was told something by my professor at NYU, and I always kind of stick with it, which is he said, film is about what's necessary, not about what's interesting. You know, and every one of the characters we interviewed in this film had an interesting story to tell. I'll give you a good example. There's a Texas preacher in the film who's called James Bond, you would have seen. He's actually a gay preacher who has this entire story about coming out as a gay preacher in the church. And it was this incredible story. And when we filmed it, we were like, wow, like, look at this story we've captured. Unfortunately, it didn't have much to do with the fact his name was James Bond in the end. And so whilst he's in the film, that part of the story had to be left out. And even the Guyanese politician who you mentioned earlier, he, a lot like our James Bond Indiana, has actually had a lot of problems with the police down in Guyana. And he was actually in a riot where he was shot several times by the police with rubber bullets. And what was really interesting is that the police fired on this crowd with rubber bullets and other people got hit once or twice. He got hit 27 times, right? So, but who do they point their guns at? James Bond. Like if you're targeting something, they point at him. And that was an amazing story, but we already had a James Bond in Indiana who was being targeted by the police. So often it was simply a thing of, we didn't want to double up and only keep kind of what was necessary. I will say, though, when I watched the film, I actually can't believe that we managed to get in everything that we did kind of within quite a tight kind of 80-minute time frame. And yeah, there's in the end, there isn't something that I really regret isn't there. And I think, not to go too far into spoilers, but a lot of it is puzzle pieces that are coming together towards a final conclusion. And every one of those puzzle pieces is in there, you know, from our James Bond in New York, when he says he can't find himself in the newspaper and he's searching through, and that may seem extraneous the first time you watch the film. The second time you watch the film, that takes on a completely different meaning. And so everything that needs to be there, I think, is there. Yeah.
That's fantastic. No, that's, and I had to ask. So this is I hope it's my only crass question, but I'm an American, so it's typical of us to ask these type of things. Can somebody make money off of a documentary like this?
I guess I'm about to find out, Dave. Yeah, I'm trying to. You know, I'm trying to. I don't think, you know, if I made my money back right now, I'd probably be happy. Yeah, but I think, yeah, we are trying to sell the film. Yeah. And
so how does that happen? Does it then go to a distributor? Does it go onto Netflix and people pay for that?
Sure. I can only go into so many things right now, David, to be honest, on that point. But the general policy kind of with a first film like this is you hit the International Film Festival circuit. So we just premiered in New Zealand. We're about to premiere at another festival in Melbourne. And then we should have some more kind of festivals coming up after that. And basically you hope the film gets in front of the right people. You know, and that tends to go from sales agents up to distributors, up to your final exhibitor, which obviously these days for documentary especially tends to be more one of the streamers. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, look, you know, if anyone at Netflix is watching this and wants to give me a call, I'll send you the same link that I sent to David. But I'll be honest, David, when we showed this in New Zealand last week, it was the first time I showed it with an audience, and I was pretty terrified because this is a bit of a wacky concept, and I didn't know how it would play to an audience, and I couldn't believe how well it played to them. They laughed at things I didn't even realize were jokes because I'm so used to these guys. And then I think some of the more emotional moments of the film kind of really gripped them as well. And we're up on Rotten Tomatoes now, and we've had, not to gloat, but we've had perfect review. There isn't a bad review online yet. So I feel that hopefully Bond fans will get to see this later this year. And yes, and if I make some money out of it, David, I won't say no.
I told you, crass, but I love the process. I'm going to say something that's maybe a bit abrupt. It's something I wanted to tell you even before we talked today, but now that I've spoken to you more, it resonates probably even more so. I'm very proud of this documentary, which may seem like a strange thing since I had nothing to do with it at all. But as I watch this and consume this, and even as I'm speaking to you, I realize that somebody out there made an incredible professional documentary. At its core and basis foundation, it's about James Bond, but it quickly turns into about people and about their lives and about the drama and persevering, which is truly the core of a James Bond movie and a book. And I just walked away, and even now as I'm talking to you, is it strange that I feel a great sense of pride in this and I had nothing to do with it?
I mean, I think, it's funny. I think this film has, I'm speaking to you here on the Bond Experience, and I think this film actually is about a lot of the kind of things that maybe your channel doesn't directly talk about, but it is about, the concept of how men around the world kind of want to be James Bond and the way they do. And then we get to meet these men who actually are James Bond and see how they feel about it. But yeah, I mean, our goal with this film was, this isn't meant to be a DVD extra. We wanted to make a film which existed entirely in its own right, but that happens to exist within what's called the Bond phenomena. But I mean the Bond phenomena is obviously, the plot of Skyfall doesn't terribly affect my characters. What affects my characters is what's called the Bond phenomena, and we've all heard that term. But I think for me that almost takes on an almost supernatural quality in this film, because these guys exist. In the film, it's literally represented as screens hovering above the cities that these guys exist in, and they kind of live in, especially the digital noise of this phenomena. And it's weird. It's not one of my favorite films, but I'd almost compare it to the Bourne Legacy, which is the spin-off fourth Jason Bourne film. But in that film, the events of Bourne 3 are happening on TV screens behind Jeremy Renner's character and in the background of that film. And for me, this is literally, in this film, you have these quite dramatic stories, whilst on the TVs behind the characters, there's a story about the premiere of Spectre happening. And that's what kind of really interested me about how you can have these stories going on where the Bond phenomena is having a direct kind of to and fro pull, between what's happening with them. But that was our goal, to kind of make something that was very much stood on its own feet. And I definitely want to be able to speak to you, David, about the kind of ornithologist Fleming side of it as well, because I think that is the most James Bond side of this. That's part of it. But definitely we cover some Bond history in this at the same time. Yeah.
Please. I mean, do you want to talk about that aspect of the?
Well, yeah. I mean, because I know you're such a kind of Fleming fan. I think you've just come back from GoldenEye, where a lot of the film actually takes place. But in terms of kind of your viewers and things here, I think the big thing was that this film covers the ornithologist James Bond. And I think we all know that story, which is that Ian Fleming was looking for a name for the character and wanted to find a really flat, quiet name. And he saw this book of Birds of the West Indies on the bookshelf and went, I'm going to steal that name. And he says, and so I simply stole it and used it. I think it hadn't really been followed up too much what happened actually after that. And so what we did was we looked into the original, the ornithologist James Bond. And as it turned out, he actually did in America find out, in Philadelphia, funnily enough, where he's from, that Ian Fleming had stolen his name. They saw an interview with Ian Fleming and found out about this, and they weren't too happy about it. And in particular, his wife, Mary, wasn't too happy about it. And what we found is she had actually written a book in the 1960s called How 007 Got His Name. And from that, she explained everything that happened to them afterwards, which eventually involved them contacting and meeting Ian Fleming at GoldenEye, which I had never known before. But what we managed to do was, for that book that she wrote, she had gone on like a bit of a book tour back in the 1960s and had done some radio interviews talking about that. And so we managed to unearth these old tapes of her and also of her husband actually talking about what had happened to them and them finding out about this and how they felt about that. And I think it's definitely kind of the first time kind of anyone, at least on film, has really kind of followed up on that. And what we did is we took about 6 minutes of audio, and then we found every photo of these guys we possibly could. And then we shot a reenactment sequence that goes along with that original audio, and also found the footage of them meeting Fleming. And I think especially for, I don't know how you felt about that, David, or how much of that story you yourself knew, but I think we do cover a bit of untold Bond history here as well.
You did. And so I knew the upfront part. I think a lot of people do. But then in all the documentaries and all the DVD extras, it just ends. What I loved was, to your point, the wife's point of view and the terseness of it all. And the best part about it is, and again, we're dancing over spoilers here, but was Ian Fleming's reaction to them contacting him. And, oh my gosh, am I going to get sued? And, you have the rights to my name. And then finally, what he gives to the family and then what they do with that gift later on. And then you can see I'm dancing around spoilers because it's such a wonderful ending to that story that kind of just, it percolates it through. So yes, you are correct. It is the most defined and descriptive story that elongates, I think, what many fanatical people that follow Bond knew, but this just extends the story out tremendously.
Yeah, and I think it kind of takes it to the end of that. And I mean, the funny thing with Fleming is Fleming actually died just a few months after he met the Bonds, and you see that footage in the film. That, in a weird way, it kind of gave me a new perspective on Fleming slightly, that he'd created this character, he'd stolen this man's name. But I'd never known that just a couple of months before his death, he'd actually come face to face with James Bond. And again, not to go too far into spoilers, kind of in a weird way gave them some money as a result of it. And I'd never known that before. And yeah, even though I've obviously never met these people, I think we did manage to really sort of bring them to life on screen in a pretty major way. And yeah, and certainly in that footage of Fleming, the look on his face is just, it's priceless.
Yeah, and I have to say too, since we're jumping into this a little bit anyway, if somebody had come to my house, like they went to Fleming's house, unannounced and unexpected, rang the doorbell and said, "Hi, you're David from the Bond Experience. I want to talk to you because you took something from me." I wouldn't let them in for coffee and tea and drinks and sandwiches. It's just, it did show a different Fleming in a different part of his life where I almost thought, and maybe this is where you're going too, maybe he knew about his own mortality at that point and was just like, I got to make some amends here.
Yeah, amends is an interesting word for it. Yeah, I think he, maybe he was at that point in his life, and maybe he was just at GoldenEye and there wasn't much happening that day. And Fleming was a man with a great sense of humor, and I think he really appreciated the story. It's not in the film because he never said it on camera, but apparently what he said was this will sell more of your books and mine, as in the ornithologist's books about birds and Fleming's books about James Bond. And so I think he saw this kind of publicity stunt nature of it as well. And I think it is good to follow him, but it's not just as following the ornithologist. It's that this ornithologist was the first person to experience what all of my other characters experience, literally 60 years earlier than where we follow them now. And all my characters today are still going through what he went through, in 62 onwards.
That's true. He was kind of the template. Matthew, this has been amazing because, dare I say, our conversation's been half the length of your film. But I think it's important for people to understand the background. I think the background to these things is so fascinating, and obviously what goes into a filmmaker's head. any idea, and I know you can't speak about specifics, but what's going to happen? Let me tell you the side effect of this video. We're going to put a couple teasers that you allowed us to put in here and give people kind of a flavor of the film. But then they won't be able to see the film unless they're at a film festival or until it's released.
Yes.
Could this be 2023? Is it going to be 2024? Do we have any idea of, because right now we're wrestling with a Bond 26. So now we're going to have to wrestle with your documentary.
I'm looking to get this out sooner rather than later. You say you can't see it, but if you are in Melbourne on July 26th, we are having our Australian premiere there. If you are in New Zealand, it is currently streaming on the Doc Edge website. So yeah, I think probably sooner rather than later, and definitely getting word out to Bond fans, sort of helps with that. But yeah, definitely sooner rather than later. Yeah, we're hoping to see this out.
Will you be coming to the States to do anything with it?
Ideally, yes. Ideally, yeah. I have to be honest, Dave, we had our world premiere a week ago, so things are very in flux right now. But yes, ideally. I mean, I think especially the US streaming market, I think this film will appeal to. We're playing film festivals right now, but this, to me, it's a little bit closer to an American style thriller than it is to an independent. When you hear like independent documentary, it doesn't quite sum up what goes on in this film. So yeah, I'm hoping you're one of the first Americans to see it. It sounds like you enjoyed it. So I hope
loved it.
I hope that yeah, it'll be able to be seen by a lot more people in your country soon. Yeah.
And by the way, please take this for the compliment it is. I've been avoiding the comparison to the Tiger King, which became a phenomenon, obviously, as far as a documentary is concerned, and so much more than people thought. I would say that this could easily, and without blowing any smoke, could have that type of popularity with people, from name recognition all the way through to the drama that's created.
Yeah, I mean, I think weirdly, I'm not the biggest Tiger King fan, but I do actually understand what you mean. That I think it maybe is a film that might have its moment. I will say there is a certain anniversary coming up towards the end of the end of this year, which is the 60th anniversary of the Bond films, which would, I think, be an ideal time to see this, because our film takes place over those same 60 years. I mean, I don't want to go too far into spoilers, but the film kind of ends around about the release of No Time to Die. And so it really does cover that 60-year period that is currently being celebrated by Bond fans. So yeah, that would be an ideal time to release it. Yeah.
Well, Matthew, we're going to keep an eye out for not only this film, but for you and your creations. And if you get to the States, you have a home here and a place. So let's do keep in touch. And thank you for creating this masterpiece.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you for your endorsement. It's much appreciated. And yeah, I'm really glad you enjoyed the film.
We certainly did. All right. In the meantime, of course, this has been David Zaritsky for the Bond Experience, and we'll see you all real soon. Take care.
بدأ عرض فيلم جيمس بوند الجديد في دور السينما بشخصية العميل 007 للمرة الأخيرة.
I've worked in a few different countries and currently working in Iraq, and everyone knows who James Bond is, Some of these people don't even have a TV.
As I grew older, I went and watched every single one of them that came out. The Spy Who Loved Me, From Russia with Love. They never stopped.
My name is James Lee Bond. I'll be 87 the 5th day of September. I just never did care for James Bond on his movies. It wasn't my prototype.
When the first James Bond movie hit our city, I was in the 7th grade. If you were in the Assemblies of God Church, you didn't go to movies. It was forbidden. But suddenly, I picked up a new nickname. I became 00. But to be honest with you, I was such a dork, the girls didn't flock to me anyway.
Thanks for watching this episode. If you want to be up on the latest from the Bond experience, just click on this subscribe and subscribe to our channel. You're going to get all the latest and greatest information, plus some exclusive content. And by the way, speaking of content, here's something especially for you, just because we know you. Talk to you soon.